This is session 13 in the video series I'm doing called 5 Minutes of Church History. They're just videos about 5 minutes long on the subject of church history, designed to help the average Christian begin to become familiar with this important subject. And I'm using for this series primarily the content in Nick Needham's volumes on church history called 2,000 Years of Christ's Power, which I would highly recommend. And right now I'm in the third video in which I'm discussing the persecution of the earliest Christians in the first several centuries of the church. Now, at this point, I want to pick up in the 3rd century, the 200s AD, and describe what is, in many ways, the last and greatest persecution that the earliest Christians endured. It begins with a soldier named Diocletian seizing power and becoming the Roman emperor in 284 AD. He reorganized the Roman Empire with himself as emperor over the East and another person as emperor over the West. Himself and the other emperor were called Augustuses, and then each Augustus had a Caesar under him who was due to replace him when he retired or died. Now, Diocletian began out being tolerant of religions, including Christianity, but his Caesar, that is the sort of junior emperor under him, named Galerius, was definitely not. He was extremely hostile to Christianity. And eventually, Galerius so influenced Diocletian that Diocletian came to share Galerius's hostility toward Christianity. And in 303, Diocletian, under the influence of Galerius, issued 4 infamous edicts, which resulted in the most terrible period of Roman persecution against the church. The first edict declared that all church buildings were to be destroyed, all Bibles burnt, and all Christians forbidden to worship. The second edict declared that all clergy were to be arrested and imprisoned. The third edict declared that all clergy were to offer sacrifice to the gods or be tortured. And the fourth edict declared that all citizens throughout the empire were to sacrifice to the gods or be executed. Now, in the western part of the empire, the other side of the empire, which was under the rule of the other Augustus, Maximian, was not part of the Eastern Empire influenced by Galerius. And Maximian was himself hostile to Christianity, but his Caesar, who also had charge over some part of the empire, named Constantius, was more tolerant. In 305 AD, the 2 Augustuses, Diocletian and Maximian, stepped down, and their Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, took their place. And this meant that the persecution became even worse in the east under Galerius and eased up in the west under Constantius. But then, in short order, 306, Constantius died, and the west was divided between Constantius' son, the famous Constantine, who was tolerant of Christians, and Maxentius, who was not. So, as a result, persecution continued in the west and in the regions controlled by Maxentius. And of course, it continued in the east as well. In 311, Galerius in the east, having failed to destroy Christianity through all of his intense efforts to persecute the church in the Eastern Empire, eventually gave up and instituted a policy of religious toleration. But soon afterwards, he died. And then the eastern part of the empire was divided between Licinius, who continued Galerius's late policy of toleration, and Maximinus Daia, who resumed persecution. And so here we see, for the most part, a period of intense empire-wide persecution, with the exception that at times certain portions of the empire were ruled by a more tolerant Caesar or Augustus for a time. And through this period, although the persecution was worse than the previous persecutions, yet interestingly, the church largely remained more faithful than it had in the past. And this, in other words, there was less apostasy and more willingness to endure suffering, even unto death. Nick Needham recounts an incident that we still have a record of how a Christian named Andronicus responded when Roman authorities tried to force him to sacrifice to the gods. They even stuffed his mouth with the bread and meat of a sacrificial ritual. And this is how the interchange went. Andronicus said, "May vengeance fall upon you, savage tyrant, you and those who have empowered you to desecrate me with your unholy sacrifices," shouted Andronicus. "What you have done to God's servants will one day be revealed to you, you monstrous evildoer," replied the magistrate. "Do you dare curse the emperors from whom the world has enjoyed so long and deep a peace?" "I have indeed cursed them, and will do so again," Andronicus said. "They are public enemies, drinkers of blood, and they have turned the world upside down," replied the magistrate, and he was executed. Well, I hope this gives you a sense of the gravity of this and the extent of this final period of persecution in the church. Until next time.